Good evening, everybody. For all of you who have joined in time, I thank you very much. We at Homeocon Foundation like to be on time, as you know from our past experiences with Homeocon, the main seminars. Uh, it gives me great pleasure, and I don't really need to introduce our speaker next. It's Dr. Amit Habbu. He is a MD Medicine by education. He has done his MF Hom in homeopathy from the faculty of Royal College of Homeopathy, London. And he is a wonderful teacher. And I'm so happy that Amit has agreed to take this very, very important and I think very useful topic for day-to-day clinical practice about liver functions and their tests. So without wasting much time, we'll start with Dr. Amit's lecture and hand over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Sachin. So I thought, I don't really like this lecture kind of a platform. If there is some interaction, it's always good. So if anybody has any comments to make, any opinions, any questions, any other opinions, please feel free to. I will take breaks from time to time. What I thought I would do today is, to discuss a bit about the basics of approaching a patient with disordered liver functions and how we approach the analysis of an abnormal LFT report. But I thought it's always better to do it, with sort of a case to go by. So I will just present a case. It's not my own. It's from the literature, but I think it's very instructive in helping us to talk about abnormal LFTs. So let me just share my screen. Everything okay, Sachin? Are you able to see the screen?
Yeah, the screen is perfect. I can hear you clearly. Just a request to everybody who has joined, make sure your microphones are on mute. And as he said, he'd be very happy to take questions and doubts. But when he is talking, I would request everybody to please keep on mute. So it makes the recording also much easier. Thank you.
If there are any inadvertent unmute Sachin, then what you can do is, just press mute all and ask me to unmute myself so that I can do that. So I've loosely labeled this as just clinico-pathologic remedy correlation. We used to have these CPC discussions where it's only a clinico-pathologic correlation. But I thought that for homeopathy we should extend it to the remedies to sort of give us a broad understanding of what the pathology, what kind of pathology the remedy may address, and then separate the homeopathic symptoms from this, so that we are able to make better prescriptions. But effectively, what I'm going to be discussing is liver dysfunction and how to approach the evaluation of abnormal LFTs. Just give me a second. I think my screen is freezing. I'm trying again. So I think I'll keep it like this, Sachin. Maybe is this still all right? Anyway, they're just plain slides. So this is a 20-year-old female, a college student, who presents with intermittent abdominal pain. This is a short history of about 2 to 3 weeks. Intermittent abdominal pain, fatigue. She wants to lie down all the time. High colored urine. No fever or arthralgias. A lot of college stress is ongoing. She's BP, low spirited, anxious, and so on. So these are the chief complaints. I would like some of the younger colleagues to make some comments at this point in time as to what goes through your mind when you come across these presenting complaints. Anybody, just please unmute yourself. And there are no wrong answers in this. Some answers are just more right than the others. That's about it.
Amit, you want them to put it on chat, or do you want them to unmute and talk to you?
No, just unmute and speak. Let it be
Yeah,
informal.
okay. So come on, some of the junior students, some of the interns, can we, I know quite a few of you have joined today. Can you please start participating? It makes it much more interesting.
Okay, so let me talk about what would go through my mind. You have abdominal pain, you have some constitutional symptoms, some other probably unrelated at this point in time, an unrelated psychological state, and of course you have the clear symptom of a high colored urine. So then the first thing that will go through my mind will be hepatitis. Other possibilities will be cholangitis. So basically we are dealing with the hepatobiliary tree, and there is no history of fever. So this is something that when you come to the differentials of various hepatobiliary disorders, the one thing that you have to keep in mind with this patient is that there is no fever. As a sort of an out of the box diagnosis, one should consider in the correct setting, one should think of porphyria as well, which will present as abdominal pain and high colored urine. But rare things happen rarely. So then clinical examination, vitals are stable, patient is afebrile. We note pallor, we note icterus. There is no edema, there is no lymphadenopathy. On systemic examination, per abdomen examination, there is some right hypochondriac tenderness, but there is no obvious organomegaly. Heart sounds are normal, chest is clear. She has a bit of an anxious look. There is with that anxiety, there is a little bit of, there's a coarse tremor on both hands. The rest of the systemic examination is unremarkable. Right. So some thoughts now at this point in time. What should we do next? What is the working diagnosis? Is there any other clinical or historical information that you need or want to ask for if this is insufficient? And if it is not, what next steps in investigations would you take?
Do we think of thyroid disorders also?
On what grounds?
On the tremors, anxiety.
Right. So thyroid, typically thyrotoxicosis will have a fine tremor, not coarse. And so the vitals are stable, there is no tachycardia. So less likely. So although in medicine nothing is really impossible, but for the younger students, for younger colleagues, you must have heard of the law of parsimony. In medicine, you try and fit the entire conglomerate of symptoms into one diagnosis as much as you can. It cannot be that somebody who comes with a, like in this case, with a 3 or 4 week, an acute to a subacute history, that you will say, you very often you will have patients say that dengue झाला होता आणि malaria पण झाला होता. That is usually a diagnosis that is pretty incorrect. Usually there would have been one one pathology at that point in time, and the other was a misdiagnosis. The one area where this does not really apply, this law of parsimony, is in geriatric practice, where there can be a pathology that explains one symptom and the second pathology explains the second, and so on. But for younger people in acute and subacute cases, you have to try and fit in the whole thing with one unifying diagnosis. So any other thoughts? You have a 20-year-old, I'm going through the history again, intermittent abdominal pain, but not the kind of pain that resulted in the admission, but with fatigue, wants to lie down all the time, high colored urine. Clinical examination confirms icterus, patient is pale, nothing much else, very obvious.
So we are looking to do a biochemical workup.
Right. So at this point in time, the working diagnosis can just perhaps be jaundice under evaluation, likely cause hepatitis. You think this is a fair starting point?
Yeah. There is some people who have asked about menstrual history in the chat. I'm just sharing you what people are writing.
Yeah. So scanty menses, but regular.
Yes. So people are writing we can do LFT and USG.
Okay. So when we come to LFT, so typically these are the LFTs that we get done, right? Bilirubin aminotransferases, that is alanine and aspartate transaminase. In the olden days, we used to call it SGPT is equal to ALT and SGOT is to AST. Alkaline phosphatase, GGT, serum proteins, albumin, prothrombin, time, and INR. So I'd like to discuss with you all, a more clinically oriented analytical approach to approaching these set of tests, which usually you will get on one piece of paper from the lab. Okay, this whole thing will be one printout on a single page typically. So although we call all of these as liver function tests, many of them are not. They are actually indicators of liver injury, and some of them are indicative of the detoxification function, and only a few are related to the synthetic function of the liver. So as far as the hepatocellular injury is concerned, ALT and AST indicate hepatocellular injury. The alkaline phosphatase, we call it ALKP or ALP, and the GGT indicates cholestatic or biliary injury. Conjugated bilirubin reflects the detoxification function, and albumin and prothrombin reflect the synthetic function of the liver. So when you ask for an LFT, this is how you should be looking at that piece of paper when it is abnormal, of course. Firstly, remember that mild abnormalities, you may need to recheck them if the patient is asymptomatic. There is, not in the kind of case that we are talking about today. But if there are marginal elevations of transaminases, marginally elevated bilirubin, asymptomatic patient, you may want to check the LFT again. But for persistently abnormal LFTs, try to recognize most of them will fit in one of these 5 patterns. Look at whether the pattern is of a hepatocellular injury, or whether it is a cholestatic pattern, or basically reflecting biliary injury. More importantly, look at whether there is evidence for defective function. Defective function results in long-term adverse outcomes much more than any other problem, any other pattern that we're talking about today. The 4th pattern will be of isolated unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. And the fifth is the last, the least common, but often missed. I mean, when it happens, it still gets missed because we are not thinking about it as much, is an infiltrative pattern. So coming to the hepatocellular injury type of pattern, if you will indulge me, let me just see if I can, because I haven't really fleshed out my my slides, but maybe I can. The feedback that we received for the talks for the last few times was that some people felt that it was a little too basic as well. So I was thinking that, you know, today we'll try to build on from really basic levels to some more complex discussions as well. And so if you feel at any point of time that, you know, it's really too basic for you or whatever, please point out. We can make the best use of everybody's time. Is this visible, Sachin? Okay, I'm using this for the first time, so just checking. So when in that report, the thing that jumps out at you is elevation in ALT and AST. This is a hepatocellular pattern. Once you see this, you have to see whether it is in the range of under 400 . (400 to 1000) and above 1000, because this makes a huge difference in the differential diagnosis. ALT and AST above 1000, you have pretty much only 3 differentials: viral hepatitis, drugs and toxins, and ischemic hepatitis or shock liver. Drugs and toxins especially keep an eye open even in India for alcoholics who are taking paracetamol. You can get enzymes in thousands. And the last is, you know, you'll rarely get to see it in our, you know, OPD practices, will be a shock liver or ischemic hepatitis. This is basically a Budd-Chiari-like presentation. You have thrombosis in either the portal or the hepatic veins, acute decompensation, enzymes in thousands, elevated bilirubin, ascites, and you can even have liver cell failure. So we can, you know, for the sake of today's discussion, we can ignore that. Generally, ALT will be more than AST in most hepatocellular injuries. The reason is because ALT is a cytosolic enzyme, while AST is a mitochondrial enzyme. However, if you have AST to ALT ratio greater than 2 in a setting of hepatocellular injury, suspect the possibility of either alcoholic hepatitis or that there is an underlying fibrosis, meaning it's a chronic liver disease, and this seems to be an acute on chronic insult. That acute insult may be alcoholic or whatever else. So whenever you see a hepatocellular pattern, look at the total number. In thousands, it has to be most commonly viral. Rule out drugs and toxins, and of course keep the possibility of Budd-Chiari and all that, but they are really florid presentations where patients will have to be admitted. Elevation in liver enzyme per se does not really correlate with outcomes. You can have patients with very high enzyme levels, but they may do very well. So there are other markers which are more corroborative of what the outcomes are going to be. So in this, of course, in hepatocellular injury, the report will read ALT, AST greatly elevated, bilirubin will be high. Alkaline phosphatase GGT will be not so markedly raised, will be mildly raised or normalish, high normal. And look at the two other synthetic functions. Look at prothrombin time, look at albumin. The half-life of albumin is much longer. In acute liver cell failure or acute hepatitis, if the patient is going to decompensate, the prothrombin time will get elevated first, not so much the albumin. Coming to the next pattern, that is cholestasis or biliary injury. Here the pattern will be what stares at you in the report is a very high alkaline phosphatase. Now remember, with alkaline phosphatase, liver is not the only organ that produces alkaline phosphatase. It comes from the bones, it comes from the placenta, it comes from the intestine, and so on. So in the olden days, we used to ask for fractionation of this alkaline phosphatase to know as to where it comes from. But now GGT is kind of a surrogate marker that the alkaline phosphatase comes from the liver. So a high alkaline phosphatase and an elevated GGT clearly confirm that this is a biliary injury. In these cases, so the pathology may be something like, yeah, right. So when you have biliary injury, clinically divide the patient into two types, painless and painful. If it's a painless biliary injury, elevated alkaline phosphatase, elevated GGT, direct hyperbilirubinemia, elderly patient, suspicion will be malignant obstruction, CA head pancreas, cholangiocarcinoma, and so on. If it's a painful abdomen with alkaline with evidence of biliary injury pattern, then you suspect things like cholangitis or stone in the bile duct, and so on, or cholecystitis, etc. But the pattern will be that where what will strike at you will be the alk phos, not so much the bilirubin, but the alk phos. Now you come to function defects. So these are situations, these are reports where neither the alkaline phosphatase nor the transaminases are jumping out at you, but you see more subtle and more dangerous problems. So alkaline phosphatase not very high, ALT, AST not very high, marginally raised maybe, or even normal, but you have an elevated bilirubin, which is predominantly direct, meaning conjugated. You have a low albumin, or you have an elevated prothrombin time. These are the patients that you should be careful with. These are the patients where liver disease may reduce their life expectancy. These are the patients who may be already cirrhotic or may be heading towards cirrhosis, and so be careful with when we treat these. So these are the kind of cases that, you know, when a hepatologist looks at the report, and, you know, I think that all of us physicians, we should be able to evaluate the patients as well as any specialist would, except for the fact that we don't do the procedures. We don't do the liver biopsies. We don't do, right. So we don't do the liver biopsies or the angiographies and you know, the dialysis and so on, but the analysis we should be able to do just as well as anybody else. Then we come to the pattern where there is isolated, unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. This is actually not commonly a hepatic abnormality of any significance. The first possibility is that this is hemolysis or a hemorrhage somewhere, and the second possibility is Gilbert syndrome, which is present in about 5% of the population. You get marginally elevated bilirubins, predominantly unconjugated. ALT, AST are normal, alkaline phosphatase is normal, bilirubins are around 2.5 to 3.5, and physiological stress or fasting are triggers. And these patients need counseling, and sort of reassurance that this is not going to affect anything in the long run. And of course, if it's hemolysis or that needs to be evaluated independently. And the least common pattern is an infiltrative pattern. Here, all that you can see is an alkaline phosphatase that is elevated. There's no elevation of bilirubin. The ALTs and ASTs are completely normal.
Amit, you're good to go. Somebody had kept the microphone on. Please just be careful.
Yeah. No, so no worries. So this infiltrative pattern, the kind of pathologies that produce this pattern are things like sarcoid, amyloid. All that you get in an LFT is clinically all that the patient says not really feeling so well, not doing well. There may be a little bit of edema, there may be low-grade fever, little bit of anorexia. Most of the other labs may be normal or marginally abnormal, and the LFT shows that alk-phos is high. Everything else is normal. GGT is slightly elevated, which confirms that the alk-phos comes from the liver. And this is a situation where perhaps only a biopsy can give the diagnosis. So anybody has any questions or any comments on this pattern identification?
People can please also put it in the chat box. I can ask Dr. Amit, because if you're feeling shy to talk, I wonder why students aren't asking questions.
Okay, so I'm just repeating. ALT, AST go together. Alk-phos, GGT are a duo again. Bilirubin, albumin, prothrombin time go together. They indicate function defects. Unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia, other than Gilbert syndrome, which is also benign, is not a hepatic condition. I mean, there are rare other syndromes. Those are pediatric syndromes, Crigler-Najjar and so on, where you'll get unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia and it will affect life expectancy. But for all practical purposes, we will not see them in our practices. And last is the infiltrative pattern. Isolated alk-phos raised, elevated GGT confirms that it is hepatic. Nothing else is abnormal, and a liver biopsy may be required. So now coming back to this patient of ours, 20-year-old female with short history of jaundice. She was also pale. Menses were scanty. So I mean the anemia doesn't seem to be nutrition wise. She is all right. So yeah, so it doesn't seem to be, at least on history, doesn't seem to be iron deficiency anemia. Right. So we asked for LFT for this patient. Total bilirubin 13.3, direct 8.1, indirect 5.2. ALT and ASTs are in the thousands. Alk-phos is quite low. GGTP is low. Proteins are okayish. Yeah. So we are here. What should stare at you is not the bilirubin. What should stare at you is the ALT AST. This is a hepatocellular pattern of injury. So we are dealing with a liver disease. Whether the bilirubin was 10 or 13 or 8 directly does not make as much a difference in diagnosis. And your markers for biliary injury are actually very low. So far there is nothing that is surprising, right? So working diagnosis was hepatitis. Confirmed hepatocellular injury is there. Enzymes are in the thousands. So we have 3 differentials typically for enzymes in thousands: viral, drugs and toxins, and ischemic. So drug history is fine. So typically, which drugs cause this kind of a thing? Like I said, look at the combination of alcohol and paracetamol. Of course, AKT is an important one when it comes to hepatocellular injury. Steroids, anabolic steroids is mainly for biliary injury patterns where you'll get elevated alphos with elevated bilirubin. So all that is negative in this girl. There's no setting. I mean, clinically there is no for Budd-Chiari syndrome. You get a tender enlarged liver. There may be ascites. There may be signs of liver cell failure. All those are not there in this patient. So probably we are looking at viral or some obscure toxin that we don't know. Any thoughts, comments now by further investigations?
Someone has asked about alpha fetoprotein. So I don't know if it's relevant to bring that up here or you'll discuss it later.
No, sure. Alpha fetoprotein marker of HCC, right? So is this a setting for HCC? 20-year-old, what causes HCC is basically most HCCs today are secondary on a background of cirrhosis, usually of Hep B or Hep C cirrhosis. So you in Southeast Asia, the Hep B transmission is vertical, while in the West it's parenteral. So because of vertical transmission and children born with hepatitis B, so you can expect HCC even in the third or fourth decade. But honestly, this is not the presentation where one would suspect HCC. So AFP at this point in time, unless imaging suggests something, is not something that I would look at. Any other suggestions?
So would we look for viral markers? Are we going to do?
Yeah. So viral markers, yes, definitely. So in the hepatitis viruses, which are the ones that will cause enzyme elevations in thousands. So you need basically acute viral hepatitis. A is possible. Hepatitis E is possible, and in E you have to be careful in pregnancy because the outcomes are very bad. B can also cause acute viral hepatitis. Usually enzymes will not be in thousands, but when a patient gets an acute presentation in B, 95% of them will clear the virus. There will be no chronicity. So we go on to do the other lab, and we had noticed that the patient was pale. So hemoglobin is 8. The total count is fine. Differentials are okay. Differential is okay. Platelets are okay. Retic count is 6%. LDH is another sort of surrogate hepatic marker, and it is supposed to be very high in ischemic hepatitis. So LDH is pretty high, and serology we did everything was done, and it's negative. So A, B, and E are negative. So any thoughts?
Isn't the retic count high from the normal values?
Yeah. Yeah.
So where does that take us from there?
Yeah, so you have a patient who clearly has hepatocellular injury pattern, right? So hepatitis is there, and the patient has a hemolytic anemia. HB is 8, retic count is high, LDH is also a marker of hemolysis. So you have this combination of hepatitis with hemolysis. And for the sake of discussion, I picked this as an illustrative case because you're sort of at the crossroads, and you can discuss most issues here. So that's a great spot. The patient is pale. There's no other reason why this otherwise well-nourished girl, I mean, coming from an urban background, there's no nutritional deficiencies and so on, and there clearly is hemolysis. So any thoughts?
Dr. Tajwar has asked about urine analysis there, and Omkar has asked about Wilson's. So you want to take that here, or you will take it later?
Yeah, no, so we'll take it up. Hopefully the slides. Yeah, so yeah, urine analysis, just presence of bile salts, bile pigments, that's it, nothing else. So in the clinical analysis, you have a young patient, young female patient with an LFT pattern that shows hepatocellular injury. Viral and autoimmune causes are ruled out. So in serology, so young female who presents with hepatocellular pattern of injury, where especially if there's elevation of globulin, there is so elevation of globulin, arthralgias, other evidence of autoimmunity, then you need to rule out possibility of autoimmune hepatitis. So you need to do ANA, SMA, and anti-LKM1. So all those were ruled out. Now here you also note that there is hemolysis and there is very low alk phos. So when you have a combination of hepatitis and hemolysis, the first differential that would come to mind will be Wilson's disease. Second, in the setting of a pyrexia illness, will be malaria, especially falciparum. Third is if the patient is pregnant, then you have to consider the possibility of HELLP syndrome, hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelets. Here, of course, platelet counts are normal. So given this overall picture, one has to consider the possibility of Wilson's disease in this. And so in this particular case, I mean, for the sake of our discussion, this is all that I wanted to discuss from the medical perspective, from the medicine perspective. This patient went on to, the coarse tremor that she had and the other psychological issues that she was having were all part and parcel of neurological Wilson's. So a KF ring was positive and she was diagnosed to have Wilson's. When Wilson's presents with acute hepatic failure, transplantation is often the only option. And so one has to have a very, very high degree of suspicion and shouldn't miss this kind of a diagnosis. Now, just briefly, just a couple of minutes on Wilson's autosomal recessive disease of copper metabolism. There's excess deposition of copper in the liver, and the presentation is usually in the first 3 to 4, maximum 4th decade of life. The younger presentations will be hepatic. The later presentation in 3rd and 4th decade may be neurological. Whenever there's a neurological presentation, a KF ring has to be there, the Kaiser-Fleischer's ring. But neurological and hepatic may not always present together. Hepatic presentation can vary between asymptomatic disease to cirrhosis at the other end, with everything in the middle, including acute hepatitis, chronic hepatitis, fibrosis, and cirrhosis. Now, one issue about diagnosing Wilson's in the setting of, normally how do you diagnose? You know that Wilson's has a low serum ceruloplasmin level. Now, what happens is in acute hepatitis in Wilson's is ceruloplasmin per se is a marker of inflammation. So therefore, ceruloplasmin rises and becomes falsely normal. So it's an acute phase reactant. Sorry, that was the I wasn't getting that word. So it's an acute phase reactant, just like platelets are. So typically in acute hepatitis in Wilson's, the ceruloplasmin becomes falsely normal. You cannot do a liver biopsy in acute hepatitis. Nothing else is there. So the chances of making a diagnosis, unless you are very careful, you can miss this in the first presentation. So if there's hemolysis that accompanies, that's a clue. And then the other clue is that alkaline phosphatase, for some reason in acute presentation in Wilson, is very, very low. So bilirubin to alk phos ratio of, I think it's more than 4 in this setting of acute hepatitis with hemolysis, you should suspect Wilson's. So I'm just using this and I'm just picking out some parts from a remedy in our Materia Medica.
Amit, before we go ahead, there was a
Yeah.
question of hematochromosis.
Hemochromatosis.
Hemochromatosis, yeah. Can you
Yeah.
put some light on that? And
So
also ASMA, smooth muscle antibodies.
Yeah, so that's autoimmune hepatitis. So that's something that we should definitely consider in a female patient presenting with hepatitis when viral hepatitis is ruled out. The factors, the clinical aspects that sort of increases your suspicion of autoimmune hepatitis include other autoimmune phenomena, arthralgias, elevated IgG. So there's something called as a protein gap, total protein minus albumin. If that gap is more than 4, then that's a situation where you should suspect autoimmune hepatitis when other causes are ruled out. And autoimmune hepatitis is one area where still a liver biopsy is required, because the classic interface hepatitis is present in autoimmune hepatitis, and the other non-invasive techniques of evaluating for fibrosis don't seem to really do the job when you are evaluating autoimmune hepatitis. And unless you aggressively treat autoimmune hepatitis, these are patients who can quickly become cirrhotic. So this is one area where I would think that autoimmune hepatitis is not something that should be one shouldn't counsel the patient that this is something that we should treat with homeopathy alone. I would certainly not. I would certainly ask the patient to see a hepatologist, and if the opinion is for immunosuppression, then so be it. Then we have to just treat concurrently and not present these cases as successes. Hemochromatosis is not commonly seen in India. It's more commonly in the Caucasian countries. This presents as micronodular cirrhosis, presents with diabetes, bronze pigmentation of the skin, cardiomyopathy, arthritis, and so on. But in those countries, it's a very important diagnosis to make, because just phlebotomy is going to keep the patient healthy. But we won't suspect that in this case. It doesn't present with hepatitis and hemolysis, this combination. Yeah. So I've just picked out some, I picked out sentences from the Materia Medica. So the remedy has anemia with destruction of red blood corpuscles, right? So hemolysis, this is basically saying that there's hemolysis. Now, one other thing that can present with hemolysis and hepatitis is sickle. Sickling, hemolysis, gallstones, when the stone passes, yeah, that's one other thing that I forgot. When the stone passes through the CPD, at that time you can get enzymes in thousands transiently as it's passing, because it causes a sort of a sharp liver injury at that point of time, but it is ill-sustained. Jaundice, fatty degeneration of the liver, paralysis agitans. Wilson's has this, right? So the neurological presentation of Wilson's is psychiatry and extrapyramidal. Mask-like face, low monotonous voice like Parkinsonism. Chronic enlargement of the liver, tendency to fall with a peculiar staggering gait. Involuntary laughter or involuntary weeping. So this patient, if you remember, was VP and other psychological feeling low spirited and so on. And Wilson's disease. So any, I guess the remedy must be obvious to all. Any guesses?
Dr. Pushkar has put manganum.
Great, yeah. So I've just picked this out from Boric, and you will see that this is effectively, this is just, he in fact even mentions Wilson's disease. This is completely a book picture of what you will read in Wilson's in medicine. So I just wanted to put this out that manganum can be, so you can consider it for hepatic pathologies, you can consider it for Parkinsonism, although a couple of the old masters, when I was reading manganum, they've said that they tried to use it because it seems to fit so well with Parkinsonism, but somehow their results weren't so good. However, I've seen my father and many of us, we have used this as a pathological prescription in Parkinsonism with reasonable palliation, no cures, but frequency of falls seem to go down, and general quality of life can improve. So then, talking about, I'll just take a few minutes to talk about Manganum. From a miasmatic point of view, it's clearly multimiasmatic. You get the syphilitic manifestations of the night pains, the degeneration of the brain and the liver, and the periosteal inflammation of the tibia. Typically seen, in fact, they say that if you get shin pain at night, it's a symptom of syphilinum. Tuberculosis, either threatening or actual tuberculosis of the larynx, with the hoarseness and so on. And the psychotic features of the mind, the anxiety, the hydrogenoid constitution with the aggravation of the cold and damp. These are patients prone to gout or podagra, and they may have warts on the tongue. So it's clearly multimiasmatic. Now, when you pick up homeopathic symptoms, I picked up those that I have found useful in my practice, and those that the old masters make special note of. So the grand amelioration from lying, both in the generals and the particulars, especially the cough. The suffering expression on the face. Kent says that no remedy will give you a sicklier face. The great soreness all over the body, especially the lower limbs with the aggravation of touch, where Kent says that arnica and baptisia will cure the acute cases, but those who are chronically in this state will need manganum. And then you will see the three phases of life where manganum is indicated for growing pains like calc-phos or guaiacum. You will have teenagers with change in their voice, and then you will have the menopausal flushing. You have the ascending direction of the symptoms with the rheumatism, which may begin with the ankles and go upwards, as well as the paralysis, which there's no overt paralysis in an extrapyramidal syndrome. When you test power is usually fine, but there'll be more difficulty with walking rather than use of the upper limb. So I think in the olden days they'll able to test paralysis, but actually if you test power, I think it should be fine. Then itching on the perspiring parts. Books, repertory, I think, says manganum, mercury, and just a few other remedies. It's such a common symptom, though, that I wonder whether so few remedies in the repertory is an adequate representation. And the other thing is where pain extends to the ear. They say from most parts, but I had a couple of cases of arytenoid granuloma who had this symptom of pain extending to the ear. So in the absence of inflammation and arytenoid granuloma, really there's no reason why the pain should extend to the ear, and therefore I think any symptom, as we know, that has no pathophysiologic explanation has higher value in homeopathy. So when that happens, then think of manganum. From a remedy differential point of view, Argentum metallicum may be very difficult to differentiate. It may have the same symptoms in the throat, the amelioration from lying down and so on. It also has affections of the joints, etc. Pulsatilla with the VP nature, the thirstlessness. Also, manganum has wandering rheumatism. They say crosswise, so pulsatilla figures in that. And manganum from those who apply the relationship of remedies in that way, ferrum comes pretty close and may overlap with it in anemia and so on. But in that sense, there's quite a bit of difference as well. So I'll just share one case. This is a patient of mine. He's a doctor actually. So his pain in this region, just below and behind the external malleolus, began when he was in Europe, when they were on a trip, long walks, a few beers, and this started. So he came back. Gout was suspected, although the toes were fine. There were no other joints involved, and the left foot was all right. The heel was okay, and uric acid was I think 6.8 or something like that. So initially he took some anti-inflammatory, but it persisted. Then I gave him 5 or 6 remedies over a period of a month and a half, 2 months, nothing, no response to I think I initially gave very routinistic prescription, Ruta, Calcarea Fluor. Then we began thinking, that this is probably gout. We did an MRI to just rule out that there is no, ligament injury or ligament strain, etc. There was none. There was just soft tissue edema, and then the uric acid went up a little bit. I guess you all know that, in an acute gouty attack, the uric acid actually goes down because a lot of the uric acid goes into the joint space. And when you do the blood test, it may be falsely normal. So we repeated it, and uric acid was 8.5. So we were, at least at that point of time, then we were, kind of sure that, yeah, this is definitely gout. So then I went through his, the symptoms a little more detail. When he was, after that, there was a remission for some time, and then it began again. And he said that, when we started going back on the full round, this was during the COVID lockdown period. He says that I walk nearly 4 kilometers a day when I'm on rounds. One of the extremely busy practitioners here in Pune, and he says generally that brings it on again. So then I thought, let me go through the symptoms a little more detail. So you took actually what led me to this was Fatak for ankles inflamed has only a single remedy, that's Mangana. And then some of the other symptoms also fit in the inflammation of the ankles, of course, pain at the outer malleolus aggravated by walking. It's a gout remedy, and aggravation after long walks. And in Roberts, in the rheumatic remedies, it says in bold, inflammatory swelling of both malleoli with stitching pain, extending up from external malleolus, always when walking. And since a few doses of Manganum, I had only 200, I gave him a few doses, and he's required it once more, and pretty fine thereafter. Yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to talk about. I mean, it's a little bit here and there, but I thought I'll talk about some liver function tests, and maybe we can have some discussion. Hopefully, more participation next time will be nice. Thank you.
I'm sure they can still ask you questions, Amit.
Yeah, any easy ones, most welcome.
I mean, Amit, the floor is open for questions, please.
Sachin, I think I've taken quite a bit of time, so I think we should go ahead with your talk.
Okay, fine, no worries. Anyway, on behalf of everybody, Amit, I think on behalf of everybody, and I can speak quite confidently on behalf of Team Homeocon and our Homeocon Foundation, Amit has given a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I know I have many, many senior doctors here, and I'm sure they all concur with me that the way he has taught
Sachin, Sachin, thanks a lot. Yeah, but no, it's not.
Hold on. It's important to say this. The way he has taught to approach a liver function test with its individualization is so very close to homeopathy. I think this is an excellent way of teaching, and I hope we can learn many, many more such things from Amit as time goes by. Thanks, Amit. So I will start with my talk, and my talk is basically going to be revisiting Materia Medica. And because you took liver today, so I decided to take a very simple drug, and I hope to wrap it up quickly so we can all go to bed soon. And I've decided to take Chelidonium. So just enable screen sharing for me.
Isn't it already enabled?
I'm not able. Now it's gone. Tell me if you can. My screen visible? Am I good? Yeah. So fine, thank you. So I've taken this drug basically because we discussed liver, and as we know in homeopathy, when you think liver, it's like a reflex action to say Chelidonium. Anything to do with liver, if someone says liver kharab ho gaya hai, liver has got spoiled, people think of Chelidonium. And I've chosen this drug because another memory of this drug was that this was one of the drugs that came as a full drug picture when we were doing first year Materia Medica, and as a surprise, instead of the usual Calcarea carb, Pulsatilla, we got a 20-mark question on Chelidonium majus. And this drug made many of our batchmates take 6 months drop and repeat the exam. So this drug has a special memory in my heart, Chelidonium majus. And so I decided to do revising of this drug. I always start with source and history, and there's a lot of source and history of this wonderful, wonderful remedy. The common name is called the greatest Ciladine. It belongs to the family of Papaversi. Which two other famous homeopathic drugs come from this? Anybody can please pop it up in the chat box. I want some interaction. Pushkar will excuse you. Which two famous homeopathic drugs come from the family of Papaversi? I can't see the chat box.
Sachin, the two answers that have come up in the chat box are opium and Caraca.
And?
Caraca papaya.
Carica papaya. I'm not sure about Carica papaya, but opium is the right answer, definitely. Okay, opium is definitely the right answer. And sanguinaria is another one. Okay, so now this drug has a lot of old history and it's still a herbal medicine. And there are a lot of interesting things about Chelidonium if you take the trouble to Google about Chelidonium, because it is used even today as a herbal medication. There are two countries that have definitely banned the use of herbal Chelidonium. One is Australia and one is Germany, because it has been proved by studies that excessive use of Chelidonium in the herbal form has resulted in hepatocellular damage, which reverses on stopping the drug. And in a few cases, there has been an irreversible chain of cirrhosis. So definitely the sphere of action of this remedy, either by toxic or by forensic, has proved that it is definitely a very, very important liver remedy. Now remember, homeopathic mother tincture Chelidonium, which many homeopaths use quite freely and quite loosely, is not the same as herbal Chelidonium. There is a difference. Our homeopathic mother tinctures are in the ratio already 1:10. So the drops of Chelidonium that you will be giving your patients are not at the same concentration that you will be using what you get as herbal Chelidonium. So there is a difference. So you don't necessarily cause toxicity with homeopathic Chelidonium tincture. However, misuse by a patient or lack of knowledge on the prescribing doctor, and if you keep giving Chelidonium for months together, there is possibility that you will induce hepatotoxicity, thinking that you are actually saving the liver. So I would like everybody to be very, very aware of this point. It gets its name Chelidonium from the Greek word Chelidon, which comes from the swallow. Swallow is a very famous bird and it was considered a bird of good luck. I'm talking about 14th and 15th century Europe. So these swallows would appear into Europe when this flower would come. And this is a huge field of these flowers, just like the opium poppy flowers. And it was believed that the swallow's eyesight was because of this drug. Okay, apparently the juice of this drug removes the films from the eyes and improves the eyesight. Therefore, Chelidonium becomes a very, very important eye remedy also. All right, so this is something, and as I can see, I've shown you the picture, the whole significance of yellow and bile and the orange color, as you can see, is there in front of you. Okay, so the swallow was called Chelidon in Greek language. From there, the corruption of this flower name came, and this remedy started being called Chelidonium majus. Okay, so I'm facing the same issue like Amit. I'm not able to go ahead. Amit, how did you solve that?
Just stop the screen share, Sachin, and go back again, share screen, and just don't make it. Don't play the slides.
Okay, fine. So, as we are all students of Materia Medica, I think it's very important to also roughly know what are the active ingredients or the alkaloids present in Chelidonium, and Chelidonine, Chelidocystacine, Copticin, and you can see interestingly, sanguinarine, berberine, and sparkine are also part of chelidonium. So this makes it very close to berberis. This makes it very close to sanguinaria. And herein you can get an idea and a sense why so many symptoms are common to this drug and to say something like berberis. Okay. Berberis is also for gallbladder colic and for the tubes specific action that comes from berberine, which is present in chelidonium. So it is no wonder that we often see an overlap. So a lot of organic chemistry can explain how certain remedies share common properties. I think this is a very interesting facet of homeopathic materia medica to keep in mind when you are studying a drug from a totality point of view. All right. This is some trivia which I picked up, and I think again it's important. The prover, the original prover for chelidonium was Master Samuel Hahnemann. He did it with 9 male provers in 1824. After that, provings were done in Austria by 23 provers. Then by Dr. Setzi, 4 provers in 1850. Dr. Buchmann from Germany with 17 provers, and a lot of clinical observations from Dr. Bodler in the USA. All these sources are the original sources for chelidonium, which is present in our materia medica literature, including Herring's guiding symptoms and the TF Allen register. All right. Dr. Buchmann was from Germany. Dr. Setzi was from France. So you have a lot of European and a few American observations. Now, always, when we say chelidonium, the only thing that comes to our mind is that pain at the inferior angle of the scapula. So these are called the important generalities. So we are just going to list through them. I think it's like a complete revision, but I believe it's fascinating to revise, and I think it's important to revise, and that's been the aim of this study group today. So chelidonium has jaundice skin. There is a constant pain under the inferior angle of the right scapula. Okay. So I definitely am assuming that we need to be very clear as to the specific locations. Like just now, interestingly, Amit pointed out about the malleolus. And see, that's given in H.A. Roberts' book. Now, these are gems of homeopathy, which will get lost if we don't read literature. So again and again, especially for people who are passing out from homeopathic college, and since I'm interacting with many of you these days, I do realize some of you haven't even heard of certain homeopathic names. It's so important to go back and read these old books, because these old books will stand for gold. I mean, they will be your bread and butter for life. All right. Interestingly, in chelidonium, and this is a very important generality, ailments are brought on or renewed by change in weather. Okay, so every time hot to cold, cold to hot, damp, all these can be covered by chelidonium. Okay, make no mistake about that. Very important remedy for serous effusions, for hydrocele, for bilious complications during gestation. Okay, so a lot of women have liver issues during pregnancy. In fact, Amit also mentioned about the HELP syndrome. Am I right, Amit? That was something you brought up. Can you just repeat what was HELP for us? I think many of us missed that.
So that was HELLP, hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelets.
Okay, thanks. So in chelidonium, in our books, in the old books, we have just one line in italics: bilious complications during gestation. It is a distinctly right-sided remedy. So you have the right scapula, the right malar bone, the right ovary, the cecum, okay? And the pains characteristically, and I think this is very important to remember, the word radiation has to come because there is berberidine present. So from a spot, things radiate. But chelidonium has a peculiarity of pain shooting backwards. This is a very important characteristic to remember. The pain shoot backwards. All complaints lessen after dinner. So now when written in Old English, normally dinner used to be considered in the afternoon in Europe, if I'm not wrong. So sometimes we do tend to have to modify. So basically eating ameliorates is what we need to pick up for chelidonium. There is a heavy, stiff and a dislocated feeling. So it's an important rheumatic remedy as well. There is a general aggravation at 4 o'clock in the morning and again at 2 to 4 p.m. So you have that typical 12-hour. There is in general an amelioration from eating, and this is a very, very important modality not to forget. Very interestingly, it is very important for bad effects of neglected puncture wounds and neuralgias connected with old injuries. So you could have a case that's not getting well, and you could think of chelidonium. In the olden times, chelidonium was mixed with sulfur powder and put over wounds for healing. So there is a huge healing properties of chelidonium have been written right from time immemorial. The type of pain in chelidonium has been described as pricking type of pains, as if with needles. The exact word in the books is as if stung by nettles, something that you will see in the remedy Urtica urine. So now I have taken the Hahnemannian schema and I have just put in a few points which are probably very important, which are probably all that you need to really know about chelidonium as the characteristic symptoms. Okay. So in the mind, being a liver remedy, all liver remedies are sad, depressed, lethargic. It's very easy. So there's this typical anguish, anxiety, no desire to move, very lethargic, sluggish people. They have a very peculiar confusion at night when they wake up. When they wake up, they don't know what they're doing. This has been coming the proving symptoms. They are domineering and skeptical, and they are not impressed by authority. Now, this is a very interesting point because the other remedy that is a friend of chelidonium and which comes very close to chelidonium is lycopodium. And lycopodium can be impressed by authority. So when lycopodium has someone who's smarter than him or someone who he has to bow down to, they will be impressed by him. But chelidonium does not have that in its mind, and this is one fine shade differentiation between chelidonium and lycopodium. Maybe sometime down the line you have a patient who you're using lycopodium and you find this is not there, you should think of chelidonium. Okay. They also have this fear that they will go crazy. They wake up confused and they feel that something is going to go wrong. So these are the very, very strong and important mind symptoms. It's a very important head and vertigo remedy. Again, in vertigo, there is this typical symptom on rising, they have an inclination to fall forward and they get a very, very heavy sensation in the occiput. Remember all the liver remedies, all the remedies that have action on the liver, center their focus on the occiput. I mean, you can take Chionanthus, you can take Gelsemium, you can take Bryonia, you can take Sanguinaria. They all go and have an affection for the occiput. So there's a definite correlation between liver remedies and the occiput. Okay. The occiput characteristically is described as heavy as lead. There is a lot of neuralgia. It's a very important neuralgia remedy. Right cheek, obviously, and the right ear with lacrimation. Okay, so this is a important concomitant to put in. Interestingly, this was something which I picked up while preparing these notes, that there is pain in the roots of the hair, which normally I would attribute to Mesarium and Selenium. Especially while combing, they feel as if ulcers are being pulled. This is also a strong symptom of chelidonium. So it makes sense to make note of that. Now, in the eye and vision, in eclectic school and in probably medieval times, and if you go back to herbal history, and there's a lot of literature about chelidonium, chelidonium seems to be one of the prized eye remedies. In fact, the swallow was worshipped as a bird of prosperity. So they often found that nature was telling them that use chelidonium for eyes. And a lot of people who using chelidonium, either in its aqueous form, directly distilled into the eyes, to heal various eye problems. I mean, we are talking of an era where there was probably very low knowledge about the anatomy and things like that. So this is just for information. Interestingly, the symptoms that have come up in the proving are there is burning in the eyes as if there is sand in the eyes, and the typical sensation is as if it is pierced with knives. So this could be one of the important dry eye syndrome remedy. Okay, the discharges are sticky, and there is a special mention that the lens opacity and small specks on the cornea can be cleaned up by giving chelidonium. There is interestingly increased secretions of the meibomian glands, and hordeolums or styes are mentioned in the provings of chelidonium. So I do remember I had this patient who always got styes after eating cheese. And for a long time, I kept giving her pulsatilla. Pulsatilla would work, but it would work after 7 days. I mean, she would have to suffer with the pain, then it would discharge. Then again, the symptom would come back. And I do remember very well, cheese aggravation is a strong chelidonium symptom. And when you read the eye symptoms of chelidonium, you know that it also has action there. The minute I gave her chelidonium, it didn't even require more than 4 to 5 days of chelidonium. She has never had ties ever since. So please keep this remedy in mind if you have a strong concomitant of fat aggravation. All right. In the vision, there's an interesting symptom that letters seem to run while reading. Uh, you have few patients who tell you things like this, and it's interesting to keep these things in mind. Of course, they evaporate from our brains because we don't see this often in patients, but it bears well to keep this in mind. And associated is vision troubles with rheumatism. So at some point when we can get Amit to take a small lecture on rheumatism, we should be aware that a lot of eye symptoms present with common rheumatic complaints, and we should keep in mind these drugs, which could probably be very, very useful in treatment ahead. In the ears, there is a typical feeling that the ears are stopped. They have that feeling that air is rushing from a faraway distance. And peculiar, the modality over here is very interesting. So it could be used for tinnitus, that they feel better by putting fingers in the ear. When they do that, that sound stops. So they keep perceiving it from outside. They put a line in the books called deafness associated with hepatic disorders, and hearing vanishes when coughing. So this is also another funny symptom. I would think that if I'm coughing loudly, probably my ears will get blocked, so I'm not going to be able to hear. I guess it's to do with the intensity of cough, because chelidonium is also a very, very important respiratory remedy. So this is a concomitant to the respiratory system actually. In the nose and the face, a very peculiar hallucination of smell is there in chelidonium, as if of black soap. And this is from the old provings. I don't know what black soap means. I have to do some research on that. I guess it would be very unpleasant odor. That's the meaning of this hallucination. There is the flapping of the alae nasi, which you again see in Lycopodium, and this becomes an important symptom in pneumonias, all right? Or when it is not associated with, if it's just seen unnecessarily, then it becomes a very peculiar symptom. Red nose is a PQRS symptom in chelidonium, okay? Very important. Skin is yellow, wilted, sallow, and sunken, again because of jaundice and icterus. Usually, unusual redness of the cheeks, which has a mixture of yellow and dark. So it's like taking a paint palette, putting that haldi yellow, and then putting a bit of red, and you get a very peculiar color. That's the color they describe for chelidonium. Now, of course, this is more commonly seen on European skins. Indian skin tones will probably not be able to give this kind of description. All right. Interestingly, again, it's something that many people forget, that it is a very important acne remedy. Inflamed sebaceous glands is a underlying symptom in chelidonium with red pimples on the face. So again, my mind goes back to people who say whenever they eat deep fried foods, they'll end up with acne, and say you're using Pulsatilla, say you're using Calibrom, and you're not getting the result. Do think of chelidonium, please. In the mouth, naturally, bitter taste is no surprise with a very, very bad odor. There is a large flabby tongue, often gives you the impression of mercurious salt, but the saliva is not characteristic to chelidonium. All right. So there can be excessive salivation in chelidonium, and there can be dryness. There is always a yellow coating of the tongue, and it is thick. The tips can be red, the edges can be red. Mucus flies from the mouth while coughing. This is something we see even in a remedy called Badiaga, where we describe that mucus as sago-like particles. But in chelidonium, you just have the mucus flying from the mouth when they are coughing. There is a peculiar sensation of heat in the teeth. I've never had a patient who's told me this, worse while talking, but it's a peculiar symptom, so keep this in mind. This was an interesting symptom. They constantly feel something is pressing against the esophagus, meaning swallowing is difficult, but respiration is not affected. So something up here in the throat, they feel something is squeezing over there, which only is making swallowing difficult, but breathing is fine. So this can be a very, very useful symptom for people with GERD, okay? And they often get this, or with globus, they get that sensation as something is getting stuck in the food pipe, but they're able to breathe. So I think this is a very, very useful remedy for that. They prefer hot drinks and foods. Everybody knows this keynote. The word peculiarly in the Materia Medica desires very hot drinks. They don't just write hot drinks, they write very hot drinks, meaning unless almost boiling water is not drunk, the stomach will not retain. Now see, remember, this symptom is not that chelidonium craves boiling water. The thing is, he will have nausea and vomiting if he drinks normal temperature water. If he needs to retain water in his stomach in a disease state, okay, now please remember, we are not talking about a normal state, we are talking about pathological states. Then he requires to have boiling hot water to go down his throat, and then only there is no nausea and no vomiting. So this is very, very important as a symptom. Gastralgia, that is stomach pain, is always better by eating, and they have a strong craving for milk, a very, very important symptom. Now, gastralgia better by eating. There are some people of acid peptic disease who distinctly are always hungry. And in fact, many of them don't even realize that they keep eating more and more because without eating, they keep feeling the pain is there in the stomach. And chelidonium becomes one of the most important remedies for this. There is a bitter taste when not eating or drinking. This is probably the reason why they keep feeling like eating or drinking. And even drinking a glass of plain water, they get a lot of heaviness in the stomach. There is a plug-like sensation in the stomach, and peculiarly, they are better lying on the left side with the legs drawn, but by bending backwards, almost like diascoria. Okay, so the stomach pain and that feeling is better by bending backwards. Nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, extremely important remedy for gallstone colic. The liver pains, again, now please note, it is going backwards. So right hypochondrium going backwards towards the inferior angle of the scapula. This is how important it is to remember the modality of chelidonium. The direction is backwards. The stools are like sheep dung. They float on water, and there is diarrhea alternating with constipation. Again, this is to do with the alteration in the biliary functions. With the bile salts are not properly secreted, so therefore the stools are improperly formed, and this is the reason why you get that floating stools. It comes very close to natrum sulph over here, and there is a distinct burning and itching in the rectum. Violent pains are seen in the direction of the ureters. Again, there's no surprise that this is a right-sided remedy, so it is useful for right ureteric colic and also for cystitis, high-colored urine. Interestingly, there is this symptom in the books which says that there is a frequent call to pass urine, but it goes away without the person actually passing urine. So there are some remedies that when the call comes, they have to pass. Like with Cantharis, the minute that urging comes, they have to pass. And it doesn't end. With Mercor, the minute the urging comes, they have to pass. In chelidonium, the urging comes. It's very intense. But when ignored, it goes away. That's the meaning of the word without obliging. Interestingly, there is a lot of mention of eczema or irritation or dermatitis on the external genitalia for the male, that means the scrotum, extending up to the anus. So this could be a very important tinea remedy too. And in the female, the menses are always too late, too profuse, and they carry on for too long. This is a strong chelidonium modality there. Now, chelidonium is a lung remedy. Again, right-sided affections are there. Difficult short respiration, better by taking deep inspiration, because if he doesn't do that, he feels he would choke. There is a 11 p.m. aggravation like cactus grandiflora, but this time it's not the heart. There are attacks of asthmatic bronchitis, and like sanguinaria, they are ameliorated by eruption. So a lot of picture mixes with carbovate, sanguinaria. It can be difficult to differentiate. The cough, the sensation as if there is dust. They feel like there is dust behind the sternum. This is the peculiar symptom. So if you get people who tell you that they feel that there is dust behind the sternum, keep in mind chelidonium, keep in mind bromium, keep in mind pulsatilla, keep in mind pothos. Little expectoration and the mucus flies from the mouth. This is a characteristic. Hemoptysis is known in chelidonium. And in children, there is high fever with bronchitis, where the child will bend forward in the position. So you think of the Kali Cup type of position, and they will not move. They like to keep their elbows down and try not to move their chest, because every time the chest moves, you get a searing knife-like pain in the region of the chest. So this gives you a shade of bryonia. Okay, so where one could evaluate this case as worse slightest motion and think of bryonia. But if bryonia fails, do remember to keep in mind that chelidonium is equally an important respiratory remedy. Chelidonium is equally and importantly serous membrane remedy, and it can mimic many symptoms of bryonia and can get missed. Now, these are very interesting symptoms in the extremities. Nobody we tend to forget that chelidonium is not just liver. Chelidonium has other range of action too. Peculiarly is coldness, as if ice was kept in the cervical region with icy coldness of the fingertips. So definitely for all cervicobronchial neuralgias, one should keep in mind right-sided chelidonium. The muscles of the neck are contracted. So there's a lot of tightness in the neck muscles. Again, like colophyllum, like probably Calcarea fos. The interesting thing is that there is a crackling in the cervical region. So there's a cut sound. So which normally we only think of Calcarea fluor. There's an interesting small remedy called Tyloflora indica, which also has this peculiar crackling in the cervical region. I know it happens to be a favorite of Dr. Jugal Kishore's, and it's one of his pet small remedies for people who have that sound and pain coming. There is tonic spasm in the flexors of fingers and toes. There is twitching and trembling of the limbs. There is a drawing sensation in the hips, thighs, legs, and feet. So a lot of hip pathologies are also covered in chelidonium. Peculiarly, there is always a sensation as if the shoes were too tight. So either there is ankle puffiness or there is tissue edema over there. And there is peculiarly eczemas of the right lower limb, especially the foot, which is a strong chelidonium symptom. In sleep and dreams, they are very drowsy and they are worse when they are talking. They, in fact, when they start talking, they get very drowsy and they become lethargic. They peculiarly wake up from their sleep because of toothache, reminding you of a remedy like magnesium carb. Again, I mentioned that they're lethargic during their day. They have a few very strong dreams, which I think is worth mentioning. They have dreams of being buried alive. They have dreams of being shot. They have dreams of being wounded or injured really badly or brutally. And they dreams of funerals and weddings. These are a few strong dreams that are seen in the chelidonium provers. So I've just put them for mentioning out there. It is an important fever remedy, like I told you about the child. In fact, that has been mentioned by Copperthwaite in his Therapeutics, another very, very important book. Please try and get it and read from it. That's the book where he describes about the child going into that knee elbow position and not moving with high fever and cough and searing pain. And that's where the heat starts from the hand and spreads to the whole body. So that completes the entire picture of heat and fever with chelidonium. The chills are followed by heat, which is of course always the case. The mental concomitant is they become very sorrowful, very anxious, and they don't want to do anything. Okay, a lot of fears. Skin is yellow and jaundiced. There is itching without eruptions, which again reminds you of a remedy Dolichos, which is again a liver remedy. So you could think of this. Dark and as if the face was sunburned, which leads me to think that probably this remedy could help for photodermatitis. I have never used it for photodermatitis, but I think reading this from the source books could be an interesting remedy to try where the usual remedies fail. There is a burning, stinging like of pain, just like nettles had bitten. So that's from where I thought of Urtica urine. So if Urtica urine fails, it's worth trying chelidonium. It is also very useful for eruptive fevers, and you get a lot of scaling from the skin of the hands. Now, the drugs to compare with chelidonium, I've just put down my few favorites. Of course, Bryonia. Of course, Chenipodium, which has got the right inferior angle of the scapula. But remember that angle of the scapula is not the point. The pain comes more towards the spine. Colchicum with its nausea and vomiting at the smell and sight of food. Kalicarb with the bloating, the right lung, the 3 a.m. aggravations. Lycopodium, the evening aggravations, the desire for hot food. But Lycopodium is impressed by authorities. Chelidonium doesn't care about authorities. Calibichrome for the spot-like pains, again seen in chelidonium. Sanguinaria for the occipital pains, for the right-sided, for the throbbing, for the bitter taste in the mouth. And sulfur, which often completes the action of chelidonium. This is how I think normally we should complete the study of chelidonium. In practice, we have used chelidonium very, very frequently for viral hepatitis. In fact, it is a blind prescription that raise SGPT, raise SGOT, and you know it's viral hepatitis. Results are outstanding with chelidonium. It brings the whole economy back from disorder to order, and results are really, really fast. In dengue fever, I have seen chelidonium work very well, especially when people have used a lot of paracetamol. And this happens very often. There are people taking paracetamol 5 times a day with double doses. And when you have falling platelets with such conditions, I tend to use Natrum sulf in biochemic form and Chelidonium in homeopathic form in 30 potency. Results are very, very good. Appetite comes back, weakness goes away, and the energy is back and the platelets jump up pretty speedily. So this is my one clue that wherever you're using hepatotoxic drugs. Also, Chelidonium in potency like 30 is great when you have a patient who is on AKT, anti-COX treatment. And we know that the drugs are hepatotoxic. In fact, the doctors make the patient do their LFTs every 6 weeks to make sure that they're able to tolerate the therapy. Homeopaths have an amazing role here. You need not interfere with the treatment of the COX actively because the antimicrobials are doing that job. But you can give very, very good supportive therapeutic support through use of Chelidonium, and they will be able to tolerate the regimen much better and easier. And people are very, very grateful. Lots of patients with very, very good experience and feedback on that. I think that's about it. I hope
Sachin, there is one comment and question about Magmur in liver conditions and DD with Chelidonium.
Okay, that's interesting. Magmur is also, of course, a liver remedy, and Magmur is in fact more chronic than Chelidonium. The stools of Magmur will be crumbly, which is not always the case in Chelidonium. Chelidonium comes as sheep dung type of stool. Magmur does not have that desire for hot drinks. Magmur has a very strong concomitant of headaches, which are better by wrapping up and putting something warm there, which is not mentioned like that for Chelidonium. And Magmur has a lot of retrosternal burning associated with respiratory distress. Okay, so that's how I would differentiate Magmur from Chelidonium. Okay, so just to conclude, I think Chelidonium, small remedy, but lots to study because it was proved by Master Hahnemann. A lot of old literature given in T.F. Allen's book, a lot of old literature given in Herring's Guiding Symptoms, all needs to be put together, study it from the source. I've tried to highlight the main key points, and I hope it has been a revision for everybody. And for me, it's always a joy to revise a drug. I mean, you can give me Aconite to do n number of times, and I will always discover that there is something in Aconite that I didn't know then, and now I have learned. So I hope I have achieved that aim, and I hope all of you have enjoyed this session. And thank you for having me here and letting me talk to all of you. If there are questions or something, please do let me know.
Role of Chelidonium. The role of Chelidonium in gallbladder stones.
Okay, so this is a trick question. Who has asked this question?
Dr. Tajwar.
Okay, I knew. Okay, Dr. Tajwar. So you're asking about the role or the scope of homeopathy in gallstones. So first things first, if there is gallbladder wall thickness, I will tell the patient that this is not a case that is amiable to homeopathy. Better to follow the surgeon's advice and have a cholecystectomy done at the earliest. If there is normal gallbladder wall thickness seen on a sonography by a reputed sonologist, I add these words, and that there is no threat that there is going to be a blockage and there's possibly going to be added pancreatitis because of the stone moving down the CBD, I will monitor such a patient with my homeopathic remedy, which could be Chelidonium, which could be Cardas, which could be Myrica, which could be Feltaury, whatever would be indicated every 2-3 months to ensure that we are getting some sort of results. In my practice, I've had results in only probably 30 to 40% of GB cases. And that too, people who have sincerely followed up for 2 to 3 years. So the results have always come very, very late. They don't come early. In fact, there are patients who take your medicine for 1 year, then they don't show up for 2-3 years. And when they come back after 2-3 years, and when they have done a routine sonography, they often say that the stones had disappeared. So it is hard to say, unlike ureteric calculi, where the results are far more demonstrable, I do find gallstones are a tricky thing. So Chelidonium keynote, Dr. Khan, is typical right hypochondrium shooting backwards. So if that comes, then it's Chelidonium. If it goes towards the pancreas or towards the stomach, the remedy is Cardas marinus. That's how I differentiate. And constitutional medicine always has to be given.
Thanks, Sachin. Excellent presentation and very, very informative as usual. We have over 100 colleagues with us here today, and I suppose a lot of them are actually your students, and many others like us who are Ekalavyas who would who are your students indirectly. But it was an excellent presentation, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Somebody's
Thanks.
asking something. With high bilirubin approximately at 20, how to expect decrease of bilirubin in viral hepatitis?
So in viral hepatitis, you're going to have a phase wherein the ALT AST goes up first, then bilirubin follows. Both remain high for some time. Then ALT AST come down. Then there is a phase of cholestasis, and then bilirubin comes down. So as long as the patient is stable, your prothrombin times are fine, and you are sure that it is viral hepatitis, it's okay to have bilirubin high for a little while longer. Elevated bilirubin in adults really doesn't cause anything at all. It's only in the children that you have to worry, because the blood-brain barrier allows bilirubin to pass through and cause what is called as Kernicterus. So in adults, as long as there's, like I said in that presentation, that look at synthetic function, look at prothrombin time and albumin. The detoxification function is not all that important in acute hepatitis. But on the other hand, in cirrhosis, don't expect very high ALT ASTs. You might have just marginal ALT ASTs, and patient may decompensate soon.
Dr. Venkatraman, is there anything that you can share about chelidonium as a short tip? Because I know that Dr. Kopikar used to use this remedy a lot, and I'm sure you do too. So if there's anything that you could share with us.
I always use it wherever I need to use lycopodium. I use it as a supportive remedy. Whether it is ordinary sinusitis or gastritis, whatever the condition, I use chelidonium in that way. Number two, in gallstones, the pain at the tip of the scapula is one of the common symptoms of gallstone. So you cannot take chelidonium as an indication for that kind of a stone pain. So if we give chelidonium based on that symptom alone, most of the time we fail. So we have to be careful in giving chelidonium for gallstones, because we are mostly carried away by that symptom. So that way, there's two things over here. Mainly, we should not be carried away for the gallstones, and works wonderfully along with lycopodium.
Thank you, sir. Amit, can we conclude? I think we've had a long.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to all of us. And it's great to have all of you here. And thank you to all our seniors who are here with us. Dr. Venkatraman, it's an honor you join us for all our sessions. Thank you so much. And all our international delegates from different time zones. I can see Dr. Anna. I can't see the others, but thank you so much. It means a lot that you have joined our session.